Richard sat at the luxurious poker table, his eyes fixed on the cards before him. The casino's opulent surroundings reflected his status as a Las Vegas magnate. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting a warm glow on the green felt table. Around him, his friends laughed and joked, their voices a cacophony of excitement and anticipation. As the dealer revealed the river card, Richard's confident smile faltered for a brief moment. He had just lost a crucial hand, and with it, a substantial amount of money. The pit in his stomach grew, but he quickly masked his concern with a practiced laugh. "Well, gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside, "I guess Lady Luck isn't on my side tonight." He signaled for another drink, determined to drown out the nagging voice in his head that whispered of mounting debts and dwindling resources. Later that evening, Richard returned home to his sprawling mansion. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the casino. As he loosened his tie, his wife Caroline appeared in the doorway of his study. Her face was etched with worry, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. "Richard, we need to talk," she began, her voice soft but firm. "The bank called again today. Our debts are piling up, and I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Richard barely glanced up from his phone, where he was checking the latest stock prices. "It's fine, Caroline. I've got it under control. You worry too much." Caroline stepped closer, her frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. "No, it's not fine. When was the last time we had dinner together as a family? The kids barely see you anymore. We're drifting apart, and you don't even seem to notice." Her words hung in the air, but Richard had already tuned her out. He mumbled a vague reassurance and headed for the bar, pouring himself a generous whiskey. Caroline watched him for a moment, then turned and left the room, her silence speaking volumes. The next morning, as Richard nursed his hangover with black coffee, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his son, Tyler. Richard hesitated before answering, bracing himself for what he knew would be another difficult conversation. "Dad," Tyler's voice was tight with concern. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Mom told me about the financial troubles. We're worried about you. Have you considered getting help?" Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Help? What are you talking about? I don't need help. Everything's under control. Your mother's just overreacting as usual." "Dad, please," Tyler pleaded. "This isn't like you. The gambling, the drinking, it's getting out of hand. There are programs, support groups." "Enough," Richard snapped, his temper flaring. "I don't have a problem. I'm a grown man, and I can handle my own affairs. I don't need my son lecturing me about how to live my life." Without waiting for a response, Richard ended the call. He stared at the phone for a long moment, his son's words echoing in his mind. But instead of considering them, he pushed the thoughts aside. He wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. As he prepared to leave for another day at the office, Richard caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. For a fleeting second, he saw the toll his lifestyle was taking, the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. But he quickly looked away, unwilling to confront the reality of his situation. He straightened his tie, put on his most charming smile, and stepped out into the bright Las Vegas sun. Today would be different, he told himself. Today, he'd turn things around. But deep down, a part of him knew that without real change, he was on a path to losing everything he held dear. Richard stumbled through the front door of his mansion, the weight of his latest casino defeat heavy on his shoulders. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of drawers opening and closing upstairs. Frowning, he made his way up the marble staircase, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. As he reached the master bedroom, he froze in the doorway. Caroline stood by their bed, methodically folding clothes and placing them into an open suitcase. Her movements were precise, almost robotic, as if she was operating on autopilot. "What's going on?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse from a night of drinking and shouting at the craps table. Caroline looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I'm leaving, Richard. I can't do this anymore." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stepped into the room, his mind racing to find the right words to make her stay. "Caroline, please, let's talk about this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it." She shook her head, closing the suitcase with a decisive click. "There's nothing left to talk about. I've been trying to talk to you for months, years even. But you never listen. You're never here. And when you are, you're not really present." Richard ran a hand through his disheveled hair, panic rising in his chest. "Is this about the gambling? I can stop. I promise I'll stop." Caroline's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "It's not just the gambling, Richard. It's everything. The lies, the broken promises, the neglect. I don't even recognize you anymore." She moved past him, dragging her suitcase behind her. Richard followed her down the stairs, his pleas growing more desperate with each step. "What about the kids? What about our life together?" Caroline paused at the front door, her hand on the knob. "The kids are grown, Richard. They've been trying to reach out to you, but you pushed them away. As for our life together..." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "That life ended a long time ago. You just never noticed because you were too busy chasing the next big win." With those final words, she opened the door and walked out, leaving Richard standing alone in the vast, empty house that no longer felt like a home. Hours later, Richard found himself back at the casino, driven by a desperate need to reclaim what he'd lost. The familiar sounds of slot machines and excited chatter surrounded him as he made his way to the high-stakes poker room. This was his element, the place where he felt most alive. As he sat down at the table, he barely registered the concerned looks from the other players who had witnessed his steady decline over the past few months. Richard pulled out his last remaining assets, the deed to his house, the keys to his luxury cars, everything he had left. "I'm all in," he declared, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The game progressed, and with each hand, Richard's stack of chips dwindled. His desperation grew, leading him to make riskier bets and ill-advised calls. In his mind, each loss brought him closer to the big win that would solve all his problems. But that win never came. As the final hand was revealed, Richard stared in disbelief at the cards on the table. He had lost everything. The house, the cars, his entire fortune, gone in a matter of hours. In a daze, Richard stumbled out of the casino and into the harsh light of day. The glittering facades of the Las Vegas Strip seemed to mock him now, reminders of the life he once had and the future he'd gambled away. He wandered aimlessly through the city streets, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. He was homeless, penniless, and alone. The man who once had everything now had nothing. As night fell, Richard found himself in a less glamorous part of town, far from the neon lights and luxury hotels. Here, the stark realities of life on the streets were impossible to ignore. He watched as street artists set up their easels and musicians tuned their instruments, preparing to entertain passers-by for a few dollars. For the first time, Richard saw these people not as background noise to his opulent lifestyle, but as individuals with their own stories and struggles. He felt a strange mix of envy and admiration for their apparent freedom and resilience. As he settled onto a park bench that would serve as his bed for the night, Richard's gaze was drawn to a young woman, setting up a small canvas nearby. Her movements were graceful, her face serene as she began to paint. Despite his circumstances, Richard found himself captivated by the vibrancy of her work and the passion with which she created it. In that moment, Surrounded by the unfamiliar sights and sounds of a world he'd never truly seen before, Richard felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of possibility. As he drifted off to an uneasy sleep, the image of the painter and her canvas lingered in his mind, a bright spot in the darkness that had become his life. Days blended into weeks. As Richard adjusted to life on the streets, he found himself drawn to a group of street artists who gathered daily in a small park near the outskirts of the Las Vegas Strip. Among them was Maya, the painter he had noticed on his first night without a home. Her vibrant canvases and quiet determination intrigued him. One afternoon, as Richard sat watching Maya work, she unexpectedly turned to him. "You're always here," she said, her voice gentle but curious. "Why don't you try painting something?" Richard shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I'm no artist. I've never painted a day in my life." Maya smiled, her eyes twinkling with a mix of challenge and encouragement. "Everyone's an artist. They just need to find their medium." She held out a spare brush to him. "Come on, give it a try." Reluctantly, Richard took the brush. Maya set up a blank canvas next to hers and squeezed out some paints onto a palette. "Just express what you're feeling," she urged. "Don't think too much about it." Richard stared at the white canvas, feeling foolish and out of place. But as he dipped the brush into the paint and made his first stroke, something unexpected happened. The act of painting, of creating something from nothing, stirred emotions he had long suppressed. Without realizing it, Richard began to paint his former life. The brushstrokes were clumsy and unrefined, but the image taking shape was unmistakable. A grand house, luxury cars, piles of casino chips. Yet, as the painting progressed, dark shadows crept in around the edges, threatening to engulf the symbols of wealth. Maya watched silently, her own work forgotten. When Richard finally set down the brush, exhausted and slightly dazed, she nodded approvingly. "That's powerful," she said softly. "You've got a lot of pain in there." Richard looked at his creation, seeing his life laid bare on the canvas. "I've lost everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Maybe, but you've gained something too. The ability to express your pain through art. That's a gift." Over the next few days, Richard found himself drawn back to Maya's spot in the park. Each time she encouraged him to paint, to pour his emotions onto the canvas. Gradually, his technique improved, but more importantly, he began to open up. As they painted side by side, Richard shared stories of his past, the highs of his success, the thrill of the casino, and the crushing lows of addiction and loss. Maya listened without judgment, occasionally sharing pieces of her own story, her struggles with depression, her journey to find meaning through art. "Art saved my life," she told him one day as they cleaned their brushes. "When I was at my lowest, it gave me a reason to keep going, a way to make sense of the chaos in my head." Richard nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I think I'm starting to see what you mean," he said. "When I'm painting, it's like I can finally breathe." As the days passed, Richard's paintings evolved. The dark, chaotic images of his early works gave way to more hopeful scenes. Sunrises over the desert, people helping one another, hands reaching out in friendship. He began to see beauty in the world around him, even in the harsh realities of street life. One evening, as the group was packing up their supplies, a tourist stopped to admire Richard's latest work. To his surprise, the man offered to buy it on the spot. Richard hesitated, looking to Maya for guidance. She smiled encouragingly. "It's up to you," she said. "But remember, sometimes letting go of our art is part of the process. It allows us to make room for new creations." Richard considered her words, then nodded. He named a modest price, which the tourist happily paid. As he watched his painting being carried away, Richard felt a mix of sadness and pride. He had created something of value, something that spoke to another person. That night, as Richard settled into his usual spot for sleep, he felt different. The weight of his past still pressed on him, but it no longer seemed as suffocating. He thought about the painting he had sold, about Maya's words, about the journey he had begun. For the first time in years, Richard fell asleep with a sense of purpose. He didn't know where this new path would lead, but he knew he wanted to keep exploring it. As he drifted off, his mind was already filling with ideas for his next creation. His dreams, a swirl of colors and possibilities. As weeks turned into months, Richard's skills and confidence as an artist grew. His paintings, once raw expressions of pain, began to evolve into more nuanced portrayals of life on the streets. One day, as he finished a particularly poignant piece depicting a homeless veteran, an idea struck him. "Maya," he called out to his friend and mentor, who was sketching nearby. "What do you think about organizing a small exhibition? We could use it to raise awareness, and maybe even some funds for the homeless community." Maya's eyes lit up with excitement. "That's a brilliant idea, Richard. We could set it up right here in the park. I'm sure the others would want to participate too." Over the next few days, Richard threw himself into organizing the exhibition with a fervor that surprised even him. He approached local businesses for donations of supplies, coordinated with his fellow street artists, and even managed to get a small write-up in a local community paper. As he worked, Richard found himself reflecting on his journey. Each brushstroke, each conversation with a potential donor felt like a step further away from his old life and towards something new and meaningful. The man who once measured his worth by the size of his casino winnings now found joy in the simple act of creation and the possibility of helping others. Late one night, as Richard sat by the light of a street lamp touching up one of his paintings, he felt a sudden urge to connect with his past. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and began to write a letter to his son, Tyler. "Dear Tyler," he began, his hand shaking slightly. "I know it's been a long time, and I have no right to expect you to read this, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change." Richard poured his heart out onto the page, describing his fall from grace, his struggles on the street, and his discovery of art. He wrote about the upcoming exhibition and his hopes for the future. As he neared the end of the letter, he hesitated, then added, "I don't expect forgiveness, son. I know I've hurt you and your sister deeply, but I want you to know that I think about you every day, and I'm working hard to become someone you might be proud of someday." He stared at the finished letter, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. After a long moment, he folded it carefully and tucked it away. He wasn't ready to send it yet, but writing it had been a cathartic experience. As the day of the exhibition approached, Richard worked tirelessly. He and Maya spent long hours curating the pieces, deciding on the layout, and preparing short descriptions for each artwork. The other street artists rallied around the idea, contributing their best pieces and helping with the setup. The night before the exhibition, Richard could hardly sleep. He tossed and turned on his makeshift bed, his mind racing with last-minute details and nagging doubts. What if no one showed up? What if people saw his work and laughed? What if he was fooling himself thinking he could make a difference? As dawn broke, Richard made his way to the park. The morning air was crisp, and the city was just beginning to stir. He arrived to find Maya already there, arranging easels and hanging paintings. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" she said with a knowing smile. Richard shook his head, managing a nervous laugh. "I don't think I've been this anxious since my first big casino deal." Maya squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "You've got this, Richard. Remember why we're doing this. It's not about us. It's about giving a voice to those who are often ignored." Her words calmed him, and Richard threw himself into the final preparations. As the morning progressed, more of their artist friends arrived, each adding their unique touches to the exhibition space. By midday, everything was ready. Richard stood back, taking in the transformation of their usual painting spot. Colorful canvases lined the walkways, each telling a story of life on the streets of Las Vegas. There were portraits of fellow homeless individuals, cityscapes showing the stark contrast between the glittering strip and the harsh realities of the city's underbelly, and abstract pieces that captured the emotions of their creators. Richard's own paintings held a prominent spot. He had chosen to display a series that chronicled his journey, from the dark, chaotic pieces of his early days to his more recent works that spoke of hope and resilience. As the first visitors began to trickle in, Richard felt a surge of pride and purpose. This exhibition represented more than just art. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to find beauty and meaning in the darkest of circumstances. He turned to Maya, who was greeting some early arrivals. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." Maya smiled back, her eyes shining. "You did this, Richard. You've come so far." As Richard moved to welcome the growing crowd, he caught sight of a familiar face in the distance. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized an old family friend, someone from his past life. For a moment, panic gripped him, but then he straightened his shoulders and walked forward, ready to face his past and embrace his new identity as an artist and advocate for the homeless. The exhibition was in full swing, with a steady stream of visitors moving through the makeshift gallery in the park. Richard found himself caught between nervousness and exhilaration as he watched people react to the artwork. Some paused thoughtfully before each piece, while others engaged in animated discussions about the messages conveyed through the paintings. Richard's own work seemed to be drawing particular attention. He overheard snippets of conversation as people examined his series chronicling his journey from wealth to homelessness. "The contrast is striking," one woman remarked to her companion. "You can almost feel the artist's transformation through these pieces." Richard felt a surge of pride mixed with vulnerability. It was both thrilling and terrifying to have his personal story on display for strangers to interpret. As he moved through the crowd, greeting visitors and answering questions about the exhibition, Richard spotted a familiar face that made his heart race. It was Patricia, an old family friend he hadn't seen in years. She was standing before one of his recent paintings, her brow furrowed in concentration. Taking a deep breath, Richard approached her. "Patricia," he said softly. She turned, her eyes widening in recognition. "Richard, is that really you?" Her gaze swept over him, taking in his weathered appearance. "We've all been so worried. What happened to you?" Richard gestured to the paintings surrounding them. "It's a long story," he said with a rueful smile. "But the short version is, I lost everything. Gambling mostly. I've been living on the streets for months now." Patricia's face filled with concern. "Oh, Richard, I had no idea. Why didn't you reach out? We could have helped." Richard shook his head. "I was too ashamed, too stubborn. But I think I needed to hit rock bottom to find this." He waved his hand at the exhibition. "Art saved me in a way. It gave me a new purpose." Patricia listened intently as Richard explained about the exhibition, the community of street artists he'd found, and his efforts to raise awareness about homelessness. To his surprise, instead of pity or judgment, he saw admiration growing in her eyes. "Richard, this is remarkable," she said, gesturing to the paintings. "You've been through so much, but look at what you've created. This isn't just art, it's a powerful statement." Her words warmed him, chasing away some of the lingering shame he'd been carrying. For the first time, Richard felt truly proud of the path he'd taken, despite its difficult beginnings. As they continued to talk, catching up on the years they'd been apart, Richard felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Maya, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Richard, you need to come see this," she said, tugging on his arm. "There's someone here you should meet." Excusing himself from Patricia, Richard followed Maya through the crowd. She led him to a well-dressed man who was studying one of Richard's paintings intently. The man turned as they approached, and Richard was struck by the intensity of his gaze. "Richard, this is Mr. Donovan," Maya introduced them. "He's a gallery owner from New York. He's very interested in your work." Richard shook the man's hand, feeling a mix of surprise and trepidation. Mr. Donovan's scrutiny was unsettling, reminding Richard of high-stakes business dealings from his past life. "Your work is quite remarkable, Mr. Donovan left the question hanging. "Just Richard is fine," he replied, suddenly aware of how far removed he was from his former life of business cards and titles. Mr. Donovan nodded. "Well, Richard, your pieces have a raw honesty that's rare to find. The way you've captured the journey from affluence to homelessness is particularly compelling. I'd be interested in discussing the possibility of featuring your work in my gallery." Richard blinked, momentarily stunned. Thank you, Mr. Donovan. That's very kind of you to say, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of exposure." The gallery owner smiled understandingly. "Take your time to think about it. Here's my card. I'll be in town for a few more days if you'd like to discuss it further." As Mr. Donovan moved away to examine other artwork, Richard turned to Maya, his mind whirling. "Did that really just happen?" he asked incredulously. Maya beamed at him. "It did. Richard, this could be a huge opportunity for you." Before Richard could respond, his attention was caught by a commotion near the entrance of the exhibition. A group of people had gathered, and at the center was a face Richard hadn't seen in years: Victor, his old business rival. Victor's lip curled in a sneer as he surveyed the exhibition. "Well, well," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the space. "Look how the mighty have fallen, from Vegas tycoon to street rat artist. How quaint." Richard felt his cheeks burn with a mixture of anger and shame. Just when he had started to feel proud of his new path, Victor's presence brought all his old insecurities rushing back. He took a step forward, unsure of how to respond, when he felt Maya's steadying hand on his arm. "Remember who you are now," she whispered. "Don't let him drag you back into the past." Taking a deep breath, Richard straightened his shoulders and prepared to face his old rival, determined to stand firm in his new identity as an artist, an advocate for the homeless. The tension at the exhibition was palpable as Richard faced Victor. The two men locked eyes, years of rivalry and resentment hanging in the air between them. Richard could feel the curious gazes of the other attendees, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. "Victor," Richard said, keeping his voice level, "I didn't expect to see you here. Art doesn't seem like your usual scene." Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world. The great Richard Carlton, reduced to peddling street art. It's almost poetic, isn't it?" Richard felt a flare of anger, but Maya's words echoed in his mind. He took a deep breath, centering himself. "I'm not reduced, Victor. I've found a new purpose, something meaningful." Victor laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Meaningful? Please. You're just a washed-up gambler playing at being an artist. Don't kid yourself." Before Richard could respond, Maya stepped forward. "I think you should leave," she said firmly. "This exhibition is about raising awareness and helping people, not settling old scores." Victor's gaze flicked to Maya, then back to Richard. My, you've even found yourself a little street rat defender. How touching." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled by this charade. This man isn't some noble artist. He's a failed businessman who gambled away millions, including money that wasn't his to lose." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had been so focused on his new life that he'd almost forgotten the debts and broken promises he'd left behind. "That's enough." A new voice cut through the tension. Richard turned to see Mr. Donovan stepping forward. Whatever this man's past may be, his art speaks for itself. And it speaks of redemption, of finding beauty in the darkest places. Isn't that worth more than any fortune? Victor sneered, but Richard could see that the gallery owner's words had struck a chord with the crowd. People were nodding, turning back to look at the artwork with renewed interest. "This isn't over, Richard," Victor spat, before turning on his heel and storming out of the exhibition. As the crowd dispersed, Richard sagged with relief. "Thank you," he said to Mr. Donovan. "You didn't have to do that." The gallery owner shook his head. "Art is about truth, Richard. Your past is part of your truth, but it doesn't define you. What matters is what you do with it." As the exhibition wound down for the day, Richard felt drained, but oddly exhilarated. The confrontation with Victor had been unpleasant, but he'd stood his ground. He'd defended his new life, his new identity. Later that evening, as Richard helped Maya and the others clean up, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an alert from a local news website. His heart sank as he read the headline, "Disgraced Vegas tycoon resurfaces as homeless artist." The article, clearly influenced by Victor's vindictive comments, painted a scathing picture of Richard's fall from grace. It detailed his gambling losses, hinted at financial improprieties, and dismissed his art as a publicity stunt. "Richard?" Maya's concerned voice broke through his thoughts. "What's wrong?" He handed her the phone wordlessly. As she read, her expression darkened. "This is slander," she said angrily. "We should fight back, set the record straight." Richard shook his head, feeling a strange calm settle over him. "No," he said softly. "Fighting it will only give it more attention. Besides," he paused, looking around at the exhibition space, at the artwork that represented months of struggle and growth. "Besides, they're not entirely wrong about my past. I did make mistakes, huge ones. But they're missing the point of all this." Maya squeezed his arm supportively. "Which is?" "That people can change," Richard said, his voice growing stronger. "That there's always hope for redemption. That's what my art is about. That's what this whole exhibition is about." As they finished cleaning up, Richard's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. His breath caught as he read it. "Dad, I saw the article. Is it true? Are you really living on the streets? Please call me. Tyler." Richard stared at the message, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. Fear, hope, shame, longing. They all battled for dominance. His finger hovered over the call button, trembling slightly. Maya noticed his distress. "Richard, what is it?" He showed her the message, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's my son. He wants me to call him." Maya's face lit up. "Richard, that's wonderful. This could be your chance to reconnect." But Richard hesitated, doubt clouding his features. "What if he's angry? What if he doesn't want to hear my excuses?" Maya placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You won't know unless you try. Remember what your art is about. Hope, redemption, second chances. Maybe it's time to apply those themes to your own life." Richard nodded slowly, gathering his courage. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the park, he pressed the call button, his heart pounding as he waited to hear his son's voice for the first time in years. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring seemed to stretch on for an eternity. As Richard held his breath, his hand shaking slightly, just as he was about to lose his nerve, there was a click, and then, "Dad?" Tyler's voice was hesitant, a mix of concern and wariness. Richard's throat tightened with emotion. "Tyler," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. It's good to hear your voice, son." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken words and years of distance. Finally, Tyler spoke again. "Is it true? The article? Are you really living on the streets?" Richard closed his eyes, gathering his courage. Yes, he admitted. It's true. I lost everything, Tyler. The money, the house. My whole life fell apart. He heard Tyler's sharp intake of breath. Why didn't you call us? We could have helped, Dad. The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. I was ashamed, he said quietly. I didn't want you and your sister to see me like this. I thought it would be better if I just disappeared. Better for who? Tyler's voice had an edge to it now. Do you have any idea how worried we've been? Mom told us you'd gotten into some trouble, but we had no idea it was this bad. Richard felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. I'm sorry, Tyler. I know I've let you down. All of you. I was so caught up in my addiction, in trying to chase that next big win, that I lost sight of what really mattered. There was silence on the other end of the line. Richard held his breath, fearing he'd said too much, that Tyler would hang up and he'd lose this chance at reconnection. But then Tyler spoke again, his voice softer now. The article mentioned an art exhibition. Is that true too? Richard felt a small spark of hope. Yes, it is. I've been painting. It started as a way to cope, but it's become so much more than that. We organized this exhibition to raise awareness about homelessness, to show that there's still beauty and dignity in people, even when they've lost everything. Wow, Tyler said, and Richard could hear a note of surprise, maybe even admiration, in his voice. That's actually pretty amazing, Dad. Richard's heart swelled at his son's words. Thank you, Tyler. It's been a long, hard road, but I'm trying to turn my life around, to make amends for my mistakes. There was another pause, and when Tyler spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I want to see you, Dad. Can we meet? Richard felt a rush of relief and anxiety. Of course, he said quickly. I'd love that. When? They arranged to meet the next day at a small cafe near the park where the exhibition was being held. As Richard ended the call, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He turned to Maya, who had been waiting patiently nearby. He wants to meet, Richard said, his voice filled with wonder. My son wants to see me. Maya beamed at him. That's wonderful, Richard. See? Your art isn't just changing your life, it's helping to rebuild your relationships too. The next day, Richard arrived at the cafe an hour early, his nerves making it impossible to sit still. He'd done his best to clean up, borrowing a slightly less worn shirt from one of the other street artists. As he waited, he couldn't help but think about the last time he'd seen Tyler. It had been at a family dinner, before everything fell apart. Richard had been distracted, checking his phone for stock updates and casino odds, barely engaging with his family. The memory filled him with regret. Finally, at precisely noon, the cafe door opened, and Tyler walked in. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His son looked older, more mature than he remembered. There were lines of worry on his face that hadn't been there before. Tyler scanned the cafe, his eyes finally landing on Richard. For a moment he hesitated, and Richard feared he might turn and leave. But then Tyler squared his shoulders and walked over to the table. Hi, Dad, he said softly, sliding into the seat across from Richard. Tyler, Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for coming. There was an awkward silence as they both struggled to find the right words. Richard took a deep breath, deciding to dive right in. I owe you an apology, son, he began. Many apologies, actually. I've made so many mistakes, hurt so many people, especially you and your sister. I was selfish, caught up in my own world of gambling and business deals. I neglected what was truly important, my family. Tyler listened silently, his expression unreadable. When Richard finished, Tyler leaned forward, his eyes intense. I'm not going to lie, Dad. It hurt. A lot. Watching you spiral out of control, pushing us away. and then just disappearing. We thought you might be dead." Richard winced at the pain in his son's voice. "I'm so sorry, Tyler. I know I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change, to be better." Tyler nodded slowly. "This art thing, it's really helping you?" Richard's face lit up as he began to talk about his journey into art, about the community he'd found among the street artists, about the exhibition and its purpose. As he spoke, he could see Tyler's expression softening, the wall between them starting to crumble. "I'd like to see it," Tyler said when Richard finished. "Your art, I mean, and the exhibition, if that's okay." Richard felt a surge of joy. "I'd love that, son. I'd love that more than anything." As they stood to leave the cafe, Tyler hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and embraced his father. Richard hugged him back tightly, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild what he had broken. Together, father and son walked out of the cafe, heading towards the park where Richard's new life was on display. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, Richard felt truly hopeful about the future. In the days following his reunion with Tyler, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The exhibition continued to draw visitors, and he found himself spending hours each day talking to people about his art and the issues facing the homeless community. But in quiet moments, his thoughts kept returning to his family. One evening, as the sun was setting over the Las Vegas skyline, Richard sat down with a stack of paper and began to write. He penned heartfelt letters to each of his children and to Caroline, his ex-wife. The words flowed easily, a cathartic release of years of pent-up emotions and regrets. To his daughter Melissa, he wrote, "My dear Melissa, I know I have no right to reach out after all this time, but I hope you'll read these words with an open heart. I've made so many mistakes, and my greatest regret is the pain I've caused you and your brother. I'm writing to tell you that I'm trying to change, to be the father you deserved all along." Richard poured his heart out onto the pages, detailing his journey from rock bottom to his discovery of art. He explained about the exhibition and his efforts to raise awareness about homelessness. He didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing he hadn't earned it yet, but expressed his hope for a chance to make amends. As he sealed the last envelope, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew sending these letters was a risk. His children might reject his overtures, and Caroline might not even read his words. But he also knew it was a necessary step in his journey of redemption. The next morning, Richard stood before a mailbox, letters in hand. He took a deep breath and dropped them in, sending his hopes and fears out into the world. With that task completed, Richard threw himself back into his art with renewed vigor. He began work on a new painting, one that would be his most ambitious yet. The canvas was larger than any he'd worked on before, and the subject matter deeply personal. As he worked, Richard found himself reflecting on the twists and turns his life had taken. The painting began to take shape, a winding road through a landscape that transformed from the glittering excess of Las Vegas to the stark reality of life on the streets, and finally, to a scene of community and hope. Maya watched his progress with interest. "This is different from your other work," she observed one day. "It's more expansive, like you're telling a whole story on one canvas." Richard nodded, stepping back to survey his work. "I suppose I am. It's my story in a way, but also the story of everyone who's ever hit rock bottom and found a way to climb back up." As he continued to paint, news of the exhibition spread. Local media outlets began to take notice, and soon Richard found himself being approached for interviews. At first, he was hesitant, wary of the attention, but Maya encouraged him to use these opportunities to spread their message. "Remember why we started this," she said. to give a voice to those who are often ignored. This is your chance to make that voice louder. Taking her advice to heart, Richard agreed to an interview with a local news station. As the cameras rolled, he spoke candidly about his past, his struggles with addiction, and his journey to recovery through art. "I'm not proud of my past," he told the interviewer, "but I'm proud of what we're doing here. Every painting, every person who stops to look and listen, it's a step towards greater understanding and compassion for those who are struggling." The interview aired the following evening. Richard watched it with the other street artists, cringing slightly at seeing himself on screen, but feeling proud of the message he'd conveyed. As the days passed, Richard noticed a shift in the way people interacted with him at the exhibition. There was less judgment in their eyes, more genuine interest and respect. He began to realize that by sharing his story openly, he was changing perceptions not just about himself, but about homelessness in general. One afternoon, as Richard was putting the finishing touches on his new painting, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find an elderly man looking at him with tears in his eyes. "I saw your interview," the man said, his voice choked with emotion. I lost my son to gambling addiction years ago. He ended up on the streets, and we never knew what happened to him. Seeing your story, your art, it gives me hope that maybe, wherever he is, he's found a way to turn his life around too." Richard was deeply moved. He clasped the man's hand, at a loss for words, but understanding the profound connection they shared. It was moments like these that reinforced his belief in the power of art to heal and unite. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Richard stood back and looked at his completed painting. It was raw, honest, and filled with both pain and hope. In many ways, it was a self-portrait, not of how he looked, but of who he had become. Maya joined him, slipping her arm through his in a gesture of support. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You've come so far, Richard." He nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "We all have," he replied, looking around at the community of artists and supporters they'd built. "And we're not done yet." As night fell and the lights of Las Vegas began to twinkle in the distance, Richard felt a renewed determination. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, one brushstroke at a time. The exhibition was entering its final week, and the energy surrounding it had reached a fever pitch. Richard's interview had gone viral on social media, drawing even more attention to their cause. The park was constantly bustling with visitors, journalists, and even a few local celebrities who had taken an interest in the street art movement. As Richard was setting up for another day, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it was from Caroline, his ex-wife. The message was brief, but impactful. "I saw your interview. Can we talk? Meet me at our old coffee shop at 2 p.m. today." Richard stared at the screen, a mix of emotions washing over him. He hadn't heard from Caroline since their bitter divorce, and he couldn't begin to imagine what she wanted to say. With shaking hands, he typed out a reply. "I'll be there." As the appointed time drew near, Richard found himself growing increasingly nervous. He paced back and forth, checking his watch every few minutes. Maya noticed his agitation. "Richard, what's wrong? You look like you're about to jump out of your skin." He explained about Caroline's text, voicing his fears and hopes aloud. "What if she's still angry? What if she tells me to stay away from the kids for good?" Maya placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember how far you've come, Richard. Whatever happens, you're not the same man you were when she left. Trust in that." Nodding gratefully, Richard made his way to the coffee shop. It was a small, cozy place they used to frequent in happier times. As he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries hit him, bringing with it a flood of memories. Caroline was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. She looked up as he entered, and Richard was struck by how little she had changed. Her eyes still held that same mix of strength and vulnerability that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. "Caroline," he said softly as he approached the table. She gestured for him to sit. "Richard, you look different." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "I imagine I do. It's been a long road." There was an awkward silence as they both searched for words. Finally, Caroline spoke. "I saw your interview, and Tyler told me about meeting you. I have to admit, I was surprised." Richard nodded, waiting for her to continue. "When you disappeared, I was so angry," Caroline said, her voice tight with emotion. "I thought you'd run off to chase another big win, that you'd abandoned us for good. But seeing you now, hearing about what you've been doing, it's not what I expected." "I'm sorry," Richard said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "For everything, for the gambling, for pushing you and the kids away, for not being the husband and father you all deserved." Caroline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I won't lie, Richard. You hurt us deeply. It's taken a long time for me to even consider talking to you again." Richard's heart sank, but he nodded in understanding. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better, to make amends in whatever way I can." To his surprise, Caroline reached across the table and took his hand. "I can see that," she said softly. "And that's why I wanted to talk to you. The kids, they need their father, Richard, especially now." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, especially now?" Caroline took a deep breath, seeming to steel herself. "I've been offered a job in Europe. It's a great opportunity, something I've been working towards for years. But it would mean moving the kids overseas. I wanted to talk to you about it before making any decisions." Richard sat back, stunned. The thought of his children moving to another continent, just when he was starting to reconnect with them, was overwhelming. But he could see the conflict in Caroline's eyes, the way she was torn between her own dreams and the needs of their family. That's a big decision," he managed to say. "Have you talked to the kids about it?" Caroline shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Richard, I know we're not together anymore, but you're still their father. Your opinion matters." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. After everything he'd done, Caroline was still considering his feelings, still valuing his role in their children's lives. It was more than he deserved, and it filled him with a fierce determination to do right by his family. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that we need to talk to Tyler and Melissa together, hear what they want, and then we can figure out how to make it work, whatever decision is made." Caroline nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That sounds reasonable. And Richard?" "Yes? I'm proud of you, for turning your life around, for using your art to help others. It's good to see glimpses of the man I fell in love with." Richard felt tears prick at his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more than you know." As they continued to talk, making plans to meet with the children, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. He knew there was still a long way to go, that trust would need to be rebuilt slowly. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly part of his family again, not just a distant, broken figure from the past. When they finally parted ways, Richard walked back to the exhibition with a lighter step. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and difficult decisions, but he was ready to face it, armed with his art, his newfound purpose, and the chance to be the father his children deserved. The final day of the exhibition arrived, bringing with it a sense of culmination and nervous anticipation. The park was abuzz with activity as Richard and the other artists made last-minute adjustments to their displays. Local news crews had set up their equipment, preparing to broadcast live segments throughout the day. Richard stood before his newest painting, the large canvas that told the story of his journey. He felt a mix of pride and vulnerability, knowing that today, more than ever, his soul would be laid bare for all to see. Maya approached, her face beaming with excitement. "Are you ready for your big speech?" she asked, giving his arm a supportive squeeze. Richard took a deep breath, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be. I just hope I can do justice to everything we've accomplished here." As the morning progressed, the park filled with visitors. Richard was heartened to see familiar faces from the local homeless community, mingling with well-dressed art enthusiasts and curious onlookers. It was exactly the kind of diverse crowd they had hoped to attract. At noon, Richard made his way to the small podium that had been set up near the center of the exhibition. As he looked out over the gathered crowd, he felt a sudden wave of emotion wash over him. So much had changed since that first night when Maya had encouraged him to pick up a paintbrush. Taking a deep breath, Richard began his speech. "Thank you all for coming today. When we started this exhibition, we had a simple goal: to give a voice to those who often go unheard in our society, to show that there is beauty, dignity, and hope even in the darkest of circumstances." As he spoke, Richard's eyes scanned the crowd. He saw Maya, beaming with pride. He saw some of his fellow street artists, nodding in agreement. And then, to his shock and joy, he spotted familiar faces near the back of the crowd. There, standing together, were Caroline, Tyler, and Melissa. His family had come to support him. For a moment, Richard faltered, overcome with emotion. But then he gathered himself, drawing strength from their presence. "My own journey has taught me that it's never too late for second chances, that even when we've lost everything, we can still find purpose and meaning through art and community." As he continued his speech, Richard noticed a commotion at the edge of the crowd. People were stepping aside, making way for someone. His words trailed off as he saw who it was. A young woman in a wheelchair was making her way towards the front, guided by an older man. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face. Though Richard couldn't quite place it, the woman stopped near the front of the crowd, looking up at Richard with tears in her eyes. "Dad?" she called out, her voice trembling. Richard's world tilted on its axis. "Dad?" he repeated, confused. He had only 2 children, and Melissa was standing at the back with Caroline and Tyler. Who was this young woman? The older man guiding the wheelchair stepped forward. "Richard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me, Victor. There's something you need to know." The crowd murmured in confusion, but Richard barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the young woman in the wheelchair, whose features were suddenly, painfully familiar. She had Caroline's eyes and his own smile. Victor spoke again, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed gathering. "Richard, this is Sophia. She's your daughter." Richard's knees went weak, and he gripped the podium for support. My daughter?" he stammered. "But how? When?" Victor's face was a mask of regret and sorrow. "It happened just before your gambling spiraled out of control. Caroline found out she was pregnant after you'd already left. She didn't know how to tell you, given the state you were in." Richard's mind reeled. He had another child, a daughter he'd never known about. He looked back at Caroline, seeing the truth of it in her tearful eyes. Sophia wheeled herself closer to the podium. "I've been following your story," she said softly. "When I saw your interview, I knew I had to meet you. I've always wondered about you, Dad." Richard stepped down from the podium, his legs shaky. He knelt in front of Sophia's wheelchair, taking in every detail of her face. How had he not seen it immediately? She was the perfect blend of him and Caroline. "Sophia," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. If I had known... Sophia reached out and took his hand. It's okay, Dad. I understand. I'm just glad I finally got to meet you. Richard pulled her into a gentle embrace, tears streaming down his face. The crowd around them had faded away. At that moment, there was only this miraculous reunion. When he finally pulled back, Richard saw that Caroline, Tyler, and Melissa had made their way to the front. They stood together, a family reunited against all odds. Richard turned back to the crowd, his heart full to bursting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I came here today thinking I would talk about the power of art to change lives, but I stand before you now as living proof that life itself is the greatest artwork of all, full of unexpected twists, painful mistakes, and beautiful second chances." As the crowd erupted in applause, Richard stood surrounded by his family, the ones he had lost and found again, and the daughter he was just beginning to know. In that moment, he realized that his journey of redemption was far from over. It was, in fact, only just beginning. The exhibition, with its paintings of struggle and hope, had become a backdrop to the greatest masterpiece of all, the messy, beautiful, ever-evolving canvas of life itself.